Great. So before I begin, let me first give a shout out to PARCC. It's really been a pleasure for me in my various capacities here to work with the team, with Catherine and everyone at PARCC. It's a tremendous resource, has made tremendous contributions over the years. Really, there are many standout features of the Maxwell School, as I'm sure you all know, but I think it's one that we're all particularly proud of, and very much in the tradition of the Maxwell School of Citizenship and Public Affairs, to sort of think about these challenges and the creativity you're bringing to think about how to both manage conflict and promote cooperation. Many of you will know, including Oscar, that that's the subtitle of the course I teach, is Conflict and Cooperation in International Affairs, and that's why I think it is such a valuable and fruitful perspective for so many of you, and I encourage you to be engaged and work with the great opportunities that are available there. If you all want to try to come in, so you don't have to stand in the door. I don't know whether there are more chairs anywhere, but at least maybe fill in a bit in the back. I'm going to talk about U.S. China relations today. It's been a fairly large preoccupation of mine for quite some time. I made my first trip to China just a little over, actually almost exactly 25 years ago. And in my various incarnations, both in government and academia, it's been something that I've been very involved with and have had a chance to participate in the evolution of this very complex and important relationship. I'm sure there's a famous ancient saying, Chinese saying, that goes something to the effect, if you want to know where you're going, you have to know where you've come from. Whether there is one or not, I think it's an important truth. And I do want to start, as we think about where U.S.-China relations are going, to begin with where we've come from, because I do think it's a critical perspective on the current environment and helps us think about where the possible paths are for the future. The story, I think, is pretty well known. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on the details about the evolution of U.S.-China relations since the Civil War in China and the establishment of the People's Republic of China. We went through a very difficult and contentious set of relationships for the first 20 years or so of the PRC, in which the two sides saw each other largely through the lens of the Cold War and as threats and challenges to each other. But of course, there was a more complex history predating that in some ways has had a chance to reemerge after the rethinking about U.S.-China relations began in the late 1960s and early 1970s. We all think about the change as having a clear demarcation point with the first Kissinger and then Nixon's visits to China, but it was prefigured earlier, even during the Johnson administration, as U.S. policy began to rethink our relations with China and the question of whether the kind of binary adversarial relationship that had emerged in the 1950s and early 1960s was in the interest of either country. From the early 1970s, the relationship clearly changed from one of adversaries, but what it was still quite controversial and a subject of debate. The basis for the relationship after the Nixon visit was, in some respects, a strategic relationship based on an understanding of the Cold War dynamic, in part as the Nixon administration tried to both counter Russian power, but also try to think about how to improve U.S.-Russian relations. The relationship with China and the trilateral relationship that emerged during the 1970s was a part of the landscape in thinking about U.S.-China relations. Not simply, I think, the often oversimplified view that our relationship with China was of the school of the enemy of my enemy is my friend, but also, frankly, the engagement with China was a means of trying to induce Russia to have better relations with the United States and to try to convince Russia, both China and Russia, to compete for having a good relationship with the United States. But there were other reasons for the rapprochement between the United States and China, not least of which was the economic one. And a long-standing view in the United States that really dates back to the 18th century of the enormous potential of China as a market and as a trading partner of the United States. And so, beginning with the Nixon years, there began to be an exploration about what kind of future the United States and China might have, and a question about how much a relationship could be built with a country which did not share the same political system and political values that the United States held. And clearly, one of the subtexts of this rapprochement that began in the 1970s is that it was possible to imagine a strategic relationship with China that didn't require China to share U.S. values in a political system, that it's possible to reap the economic and geopolitical benefits with a country that was very different in terms of its political arrangements. But it was also true that underlying the relationship was a hope, if not an expectation, that over time that contradiction, that is the desire to have a good economic relationship and a strategic relationship with a country with whom you didn't share political values, might be resolved by China's own internal evolution. That is, that over time, that China might evolve towards a more liberal democratic system, and that therefore the United States could pursue its economic and security interests without having to sacrifice its views about democracy and human rights. And while I would argue that it wasn't a necessary part of U.S. policy, that is, whether or not China actually did that was something that policymakers hoped for, especially in the 1990s. The relationship didn't depend on this idea of peaceful evolution and the change in China, although it's certainly the ability to argue that it might happen made it easier domestically in the United States to accept the idea of having a good relationship with China, even in the aftermath of Tiananmen, which put that issue and that problem in very stark terms. So throughout the 1990s and into the 2000s, there was a sense in which the partnership with China would clearly satisfy two of the core prongs of U.S. national interest, that is security and economics, and potentially might ultimately become consonant with the values agenda for the United States. And so that made it easy for the United States to think about pursuing closer relationships with China across the board. And we saw this most dramatically from my perspective in the visit that President Clinton made to China in 1998, something that I was deeply involved in at the time and happy to talk about. But it was clearly a big bet on the part of the Clinton administration to try to build a closer relationship with China, and that was symbolized by the visit and perhaps actualized most dramatically in the decision to move towards including China in the WTO. And the horizon looked fairly bright at that time from the U.S. perspective. That is, the possibilities of constructive engagement were high. The sky seemed to be the limit, in the near term, only clouded by the human rights and democracy issues. But one could imagine at the time that even those might ease over time or even go away. On the Chinese side, there was a parallel process, beginning with the reform and opening up in China under Deng Xiaoping as early as 1979 in the four modernizations. The economic interest of China in the United States became clear, just as the security interest in building ties, which began during the Nixon-Kissinger years, was also clear. And so you had, in the late 1970s, the normalization of relations, which from China's perspective served multiple interests. It helped balance the Soviet Union, but it also was a key part of Deng Xiaoping's economic strategy. And so as the relationship evolved in the 1980s and the 1990s and even after Tiananmen into the 2000s, you saw parallel interest in both sides to build a very positive, constructive relationship. And this was, from really in both countries, not deeply controversial. Occasionally, the issue of U.S. relations with China would become part of our political debate. President Clinton himself, in the 1992 campaign, criticized first President Bush for being too close to China, too willing to excuse the Tiananmen actions, called them the butchers of Beijing and the like. But what we saw was, despite occasional campaign rhetoric, really both Republicans and Democrats in the United States were on the line of seeing significant benefit in a positive relationship with China. And it appeared on the Chinese side, too, that this was not a deeply controversial policy or overall approach in the 90s and 2000s. And yet things changed, and we kind of know now where we are. So the question is, why and how did it change? And it changed, I think, in both countries. There's a lot of speculation, a lot of debate about the factors that led to this movement away from this kind of relatively consensus view on both sides of shared interests and common objectives to a much more contentious relationship. I think a number of factors have been pointed to, all of which are plausible candidates for explaining the change. The first, of course, is simply the fact of China's own economic and political rise. In the early period, China was clearly a much weaker country than the United States, both politically and economically and militarily, and so had a great stake in both getting the benefit of engagement with China, with the United States, and not much interest in confronting the United States, because any attempt to confront the United States, China would have been at a considerable disadvantage. And so when, of course, familiar with Deng Xiaoping's maxim, Tao Gong Yang Wei, hide and bide, that for China, keeping a low profile, engaging positively with the United States clearly produced some benefits. But as China became more powerful, and rather than being kind of the taker in the international system, began to have more opportunity, both because of its growing economic clout and its military and political clout, that China now had more of an option to pursue a set of policies that were less accommodative to the United States. And similarly, as China perceived its own growing capacity, there was a growing sense among at least some in China that perhaps the United States capacities were declining. First, in the wake of the challenges posed by 9/11 and the terrorist attack, but more dramatically with the financial crisis of 2007, 2008, which seemed to raise fundamental questions about the strength and the resilience of the U.S. economy and the U.S. financial system. And so you had a dynamic in which there was sort of a growing confidence on the Chinese side of its own capacity and growing questioning about the long-term strength and viability of the United States and the Western system more generally. So a greater openness in terms of capacity and opportunity for China to begin to challenge the United States and to pursue a more aggressive, aggressive is not a good word, assertive policy towards the United States. On the U.S. side, there are a number of factors one could point to that led to a souring of the optimism about U.S. China relations. I think the first was the aftermath of the decisions to allow China to enter into the WTO, a sense that the benefits of Chinese membership had been oversold and the costs undersold, particularly in terms of the impact of Chinese exports to the United States and their impact on significant sectors of the U.S. economy, particularly low-wage, low-skilled workers, the impact which has been studied by political economists and economists, which turned out to be extremely dramatic and I think underestimated by many in the United States, created a constituency that saw the U.S.-China relationship as very harmful to their economic interests, coupled with a growing disillusionment of the other key economic sector in the United States, the business community, which had hoped that the Chinese entry in the WTO would be part of a process that led to greater opening up within the Chinese economy, reduction of restrictions on U.S. investment and operations in China, which did not seem to materialize in the aftermath of the WTO, despite both predictions and estimations that WTO membership would lead to a greater opening of the United States to businesses to do business in China. There was a lot of disillusionment in those opportunities, as well as other economic grievances, including issues around theft of intellectual property, forced transfers of IP and the like, all of which began to sour a second key economic constituency in the United States, that is low-wage, unskilled workers and the business community now beginning to see China as a problem rather than an opportunity for the United States. On the security side, a sense that China was beginning to modernize its military in very dramatic ways that for the first time posed the potential of challenging the United States, particularly in the development of what's known in the military circles as the area denial anti-access side of Chinese military modernization, ability to challenge U.S. naval deployments in the Western Pacific, potentially to target U.S. facilities in Guam and Japan, all seem to raise a question about whether a Chinese military modernization was now posing a serious challenge and threat to the United States. So we have the security pillar seeming to go sour, the increased activities of China in the South China Sea following the 2007-2008 declarations under UNCLOS in terms of territories in the South China Sea, challenges on the economic side, and then a growing sense, particularly with the advent of Xi Jinping, that on the political value side, that the hope for changes that would lead to greater openness, greater freedom, greater democracy in China that seemed potentially to be in the offing during a little bit during the Jiang Zemin era and a little bit more in the Hu Jintao era, was not only not coming to pass, but the opposite was happening, that we were seeing a more closed, more repressive Chinese society. And so the net result was, in the period beginning in the mid, perhaps 2000s, but certainly accelerating after the Asian financial crisis of 2007, 2008, that both sides began to question the underlying assumptions about whether the relationship was, as our Chinese friends like to call it, a win-win relationship. That the elements of both competition and even adversarialness were beginning to rise in fairly significant terms across each of the dimensions of the relationship: security, economic, and values. And this perspective, I think, began to emerge even before President Trump was elected in 2016. We saw in the Obama administration, particularly after President Obama's trip to China in 2009, which went far less well than many of us had hoped it would do, that even within the Democratic Party and in the Obama administration, that the questions about the benefits and values of the relationship and more uncertainty about the potential areas for conflict began to grow. And this was clearly exacerbated by the election of President Trump. The campaign in 2016 featured quite a lot of rhetoric by the candidate. For those of you who've taken my other class on East Asia, I always like to begin with this wonderful montage that was developed during the campaign of President Trump, just speaking the words China in his very kind of questioning way during the campaign. But we know that the president raised quite a lot of issues about China and challenging China's behavior and challenging the past principles of U.S. policy that seemed to be too tolerant of Chinese bad behavior. It might have been possible to dismiss that as just campaign rhetoric. We've seen that kind of campaign rhetoric before, though interestingly not in 2008. But once President Trump took office, we had this very dramatic moment during the transition when President Trump took a phone call from Tsai Ing-wen, the president of Taiwan, and after a sort of brief period in which there was some flirtation with a good relationship with China, particularly during the Mar-a-Lago visit of Xi Jinping to the United States, we've seen in the last year and a half, across a number of different dimensions, a growing sense that the Trump administration sees China largely in negative terms rather than in positive terms, a perspective which is very much on display in the Trump administration's national security strategy, which labels China, along with Russia, as a strategic competitor of the United States. And similarly, on the Chinese side, we see evidence that China is more willing to challenge and to question the value of the U.S. relationship. And so where we are, getting to the punchline of the talk, which is where we're headed, is one in which most of the kind of underlying foundations of a constructive, positive U.S.-China relationship have come into question, and those questions are shared broadly in both societies. That is, the constituency that has confidence in the value of the bilateral relationship and the belief that on the whole it's more beneficial than problematic has eroded dramatically. It's not gone completely. There's a recognition of two factors that somewhat constrain the growing tension, competitiveness. One is the continued interdependence of the two countries, particularly on the economic sphere. Both of our economic prosperity does depend considerably on trade with each other and investment in each other's countries. And also the sense that there are still some issues on which our relationships are not necessarily adversarial, on issues like dealing with climate change, on issues like dealing with global public health, to some extent on terrorism, to some extent in dealing with North Korea, certainly in the past in dealing with Iran. There's still a recognition that while we have lots of areas of growing conflict and competitiveness, that there are some areas where there's cooperation. But that the first that I mentioned is really quite important. That is, one of the constraints on getting into an out-and-out hostile, Cold War kind of relationship has been this degree of interdependence. If you think about what made the Cold War and the competition between the United States and the Soviet Union possible, there were two factors. One was the ideological competition, but the other was the fact that we had essentially no vulnerability to each other in the economic sphere. We didn't trade with each other, we didn't invest in each other, and so we could engage in a pretty tough level of competition without risking anything that was benefit to ourselves. Whereas with China, as we've seen, and even with the current economic disputes over tariffs, there is a sort of sense of caution and prudence because of the risk that anything that we do to the other side will rebound back on us, both politically in terms of Iowa farmers, but also economically in terms of the overall economy. But even that constraint, so the sense of shared interest is evaluating. The thing that's holding us together is a sense of kind of mutual dependence. But even that may be in doubt these days, because what we're seeing, and I think it's a very important phenomenon to watch as we think about where this relationship is heading, is that there's an awareness on both sides that this mutual dependence is a constraint on out-and-out competition and rivalry. And at least for some, that's not seen as a benefit. For those who like the idea of this as a way of mitigating conflict, they see this as a positive terms. But for those who see the relationship as one of long-term competition, of a rising power which inevitably will challenge an established power, this is a liability to have these dependencies because it's self-deterring. It prevents us from doing tough things that we need to do to deal with this challenge. And so the answer, if that's your diagnosis, is to reduce the vulnerability by reducing the dependence through an approach which my friend Jeff Bader has characterized as a policy of mutual disengagement. The idea that if we can reduce our dependence and vulnerability to each other, then we can have it out, where we can really duke it out with fewer constraints. And you see on both sides, and I think this is a significantly worrying and significantly important trend, both sides a temptation to move in this direction. You see this in terms of U.S. policies that are trying to discourage, if not completely eliminate, Chinese investment in the United States, arguably or ostensibly on national security grounds in sensitive sectors, but really across the board, raising questions about whether Chinese investment in the United States is in our interest. And similarly with the Made in China 2025 initiative, on the part of Xi Jinping and the Central Committee, the idea that China should try to decrease its dependence on others, particularly the United States, by developing indigenous capabilities in key technological sectors. So both sides pursuing a set of strategies that make each less dependent on each other. Rare earths, chips, all of these things that have acted as a buffer on the possibility of long-term out-and-out rivalry. Each side now is certainly exploring and perhaps even advocating the idea that we can reduce our mutual dependence and therefore be freer to have an out-and-out competition. And these policies on both sides are driving it's sort of a mutual spiral, which is as China pursues the May China 2025 policy, it increasingly convinces U.S. businesses and other constituencies that might want to see or to avoid an out-and-out war with China in both the literal and figurative sense, to have less and less interest in that because they have less and less stake in having good relations with China. Similarly, on the Chinese side, as the United States is basically closing the door on Chinese investment, raising the tariffs and raising questions about the cost to China of doing business with the United States. Chinese exporters are now looking for other markets. The whole kind of global production chains now looking for ways to not depend on the United States, not depend on U.S. technology, not to depend on U.S. as an ultimate market. And so we see this sort of growing competition in the security sphere, growing tensions in the value sphere being accompanied by an economic disengagement, which each side sees as an attempt by the other to get an advantage over the other. This, in my view, is a recipe for great danger going ahead. That is, each side now beginning to see few benefits in the mutual engagement and great risks to be involved with each other. At the same time, each side is beginning to question the long-term objectives, political and strategic objectives of the other side. For China, a growing view that the U.S. strategy is motivated by containment, trying to keep China weak and vulnerable. And on the U.S. side, a growing sense, both among Democrats and Republicans, that China's strategic objective is at least regional hegemony, if not global hegemony, as evidenced by the Chinese activities in the South China Sea and the East China Sea, the growing capacity of the Chinese Navy to have a blue water presence, the port developments in the Indian Ocean, the establishment of a port and base in Djibouti, all seen as part of a long-term strategy by China to challenge the U.S. Global role. So if you look at the situation as it's now emerging and the question of what's ahead, I would say danger, Mrs. Robinson. I mean, this is a very risky situation in which each side has come to doubt the willingness of the other side to try to accommodate their interests, to try to find mutually acceptable solutions to problems. Each side seeing accommodation as a sign of weakness. And in a long-term competition, which will only have one winner and one loser. And so the question then becomes, are we now on a secular path that is going to lead, if not to outright war, to a long-term, deep conflictual relationship between the two countries? Or conversely, given this trend, what would it take to prevent it from happening? My answer is that if you were a betting person, you would not be optimistic about where this relationship is going. That while the statement about, or the Thucydides trap thesis is way overstated and badly documented as a principle of either history or of international relations, that there are circumstances in which we do get unresolved rivalry between rising powers and the dominant powers. So that may not always lead to war, but it sometimes leads to war. And unfortunately, we have all the makings, I think, in this case, of that happening. if this process of economic disengagement continues, right? There's the one big constraint up till now has been the sense of we have a mutual interest in trading and engaging with each other that prevents each side from taking risky measures or confronting each other. To the extent that that process continues, then those brakes are off and the possibility of conflict are greater. Can it be reversed? Yes, it can be reversed, but it will take a very significant effort on both sides to address these underlying sources of tension and mistrust. Some of you know I've written extensively about this. I've talked about the idea of strategic reassurance. At the heart of that is a willingness of each side to take seriously why the other side is worried about what they're doing and to look for ways to try to address that. That means in the security sphere that China has an obligation to explain and defend the proposition that in order to vindicate its claims of sovereignty in the South China Sea, it needs to militarize the islands. It's one thing to say China believes in its sovereign claims, but by having force projection capabilities in the South China Sea, it's creating considerable anxiety among the neighbors and others about its long-term intentions in terms of freedom of navigation and the security of the neighboring states. And so China needs to demonstrate that its intentions are not threatening to others. Similarly with its military modernization, there's a broad acceptance, except perhaps by former Secretary of Defense Rumsfeld, that China is entitled to national defense, entitled to measures of security, but it needs to demonstrate that its military modernization is designed to protect China from threats and not to threaten others. And similarly on the US side and our partners, we need to demonstrate that the alliances that we have in the region are designed to improve stability and not designed to threaten or weaken Japan, et cetera, et cetera. And happy to talk in more detail about what the elements are. But as you list the kinds of things that Michael Hanlon and I talk about in our book, and I've talked about in other places about what it would take to stabilize the relationship, just listing them shows you why it's so hard to do them and why one, frankly, can't be terribly optimistic that it will happen. It would take leaders on both sides which both have a conviction that the path we're on is a dangerous one and a conviction that there is a plausible, achievable alternative that is stable and will not undermine the interests of their own country to pursue in order to do it. Do we have those leaders now? Not obvious to me. Will we get those leaders in the future? Not obvious to me. But I think it is important to continue both to raise the flags about where we're headed and the dangers of where we're headed, as well as trying to be concrete about what might be done to prevent this crack up from happening, to at least create the option of a better future than the one that we seem to be headed to. So let me stop with that and look forward to your comments, questions.